hand over to Richard and do dive in with questions.
Great, well, welcome back. Not that you went anywhere, but welcome back. So, we were just about to start talking about growth hormone before we broke, and obviously we had quite an interesting discussion about the morality of doping. I think some interesting discussion there. But let's now think about growth hormone. Here is yet another example of where the athletes were ahead of the scientists and the endocrinologists. And so if I just give you a little bit of a history about clinical uses of growth hormone, we can just put that into some sort of context. So growth hormone was first identified in 1956. Growth hormone is a hormone that's made by the pituitary gland, which is a small endocrine gland that sits at the base of the brain. And it was first identified in 1956. It had already been recognised by that time that there were a number of children who didn't grow as a result of the lack of a pituitary hormone, and very shortly after that, children were treated with growth hormone. It was then withdrawn from the market because the only way of actually obtaining growth hormone in the 1950s was from cadavers, so from dead people. And unfortunately, that growth hormone occasionally was contaminated with the prion that causes the human form of mad cow disease, known as Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease. And so what was found is that children who had been treated with cadaveric growth hormone went on to develop Jakob-Creutzfeldt. And so it was then stopped. It was only when molecular technology allowed the production of growth hormone in a laboratory that the treatment then restarted again in 1987. So initially the treatment was all in children, and the thought that growth hormone might actually have a benefit in adults really wasn't determined until some of the clinical trials that were done in the 1990s, and it was then first licensed for use in adults with growth hormone deficiency in 1996. So not actually that long ago. Exactly when and where athletes thought that this may be of benefit is not entirely clear, but one of the earliest recorded uses of growth hormone come from Dan Duchesne's Underground Steroid Handbook, which was published back in 1982. So you can see at least 14 years before this was used on a clinical basis. Now, Dan Duchesne was known as the steroid guru, and he used to write training and drug manuals for athletes and for bodybuilders in order to get the best out of their body. And in this 1982 version, he describes growth hormone as being this amazing stuff already well established in power events, and also in likely to be used in endurance events subsequently. So you can see that athletes using this at least 10 years, if not before, they were being used in clinical endocrinology. So what do we know about the use of growth hormone in professional athletes? Well, again, we don't know as much as we would like, because this is often done secretively, as you would perhaps expect. But despite that, there are a number of high-profile cases which would suggest that growth hormone is being used significantly. So, for example, talked about Ben Johnson as well. Subsequently, he admitted to having taken growth hormone. It's alleged that growth hormone was so widely used in the 1996 Atlanta Games that they were actually dubbed the Growth Hormone Games. 1998, Huan, who was a Chinese swimmer, was found importing a suitcase of growth hormone into Perth in Australia, suggesting that she'd been using that for performance enhancement. And perhaps another argument about why we should be trying to prevent this from happening comes from the public health effects of the use of performance enhancing drugs. So this growth hormone had been exported by Novo Nordisk, who is a pharmaceutical company, to China to treat children with growth hormone deficiency, and yet it had been diverted into this Chinese swimmer's luggage. In the same year, in the Dutch team car at the Tour de France, there was a supply of growth hormone. Leading up to the Sydney Olympic Games, Werner Reiterer, who was a Australian discus champion, alleged that growth hormone had been systematically given to the Australian Olympic team in order to boost performance. Subsequently, there was the Balco Scandal, where two San Francisco reporters found or infiltrated the Bay Area Laboratory Cooperative, where they found that there had been systematic production of performance-enhancing drugs supplied to a number of high-profile athletes, including Marion Jones and Tim Montgomery. As part of that, also growth hormone was made, although not particularly sporting. Sylvester Stallone was caught smuggling growth hormone into Australia. He said that growth hormone didn't work terribly well on its own, but it worked pretty well when combined with testosterone. In the same year, Senator Mitchell undertook a report of the use of performance-enhancing drugs in Major League Baseball, and concluded that growth hormone was very widely used, not least because it was very widely available, but also undetectable. Dwayne Chambers also subsequently admitted taking growth hormone. 2010, Terry Newton was the first professional sportsman to fail a doping test for growth hormone. Now, Terry Newton was a rugby league player for Wakefield and subsequently given a 2-year ban. It was right at the end of his career and effectively ended his career. Fortunately, he did more than that. 9 months later, he committed suicide, having also having had his marriage break up as well. So, some of the more downsides, some of the other downsides that we haven't talked about already in terms of performance enhancement. And then, very latest, in 2012, 2 Russian Paralympians disqualified from the Paralympic Games, having failed the test that I was involved in developing. So there's enough evidence out there for us to think that growth hormone is widely used. Why is it used? Why is it still used in adults? Well, of course, what we think in terms of growth hormone is something that makes you grow taller. But we also know that both during puberty and also in adulthood, it also has very major effects in terms of body composition. So what growth hormone does is tend to build muscle, but at the same time tends to burn fat. So effectively what you're doing is you're increasing your power to weight ratio as a result of that. In the same way that there was this discussion about whether anabolic steroids work, there is also now a lot of discussion about whether growth hormone works. A lot of scientists still saying that growth hormone really has no benefit, and yet from the evidence would suggest that athletes are widely taking it. So I guess again there's the question, who's got it right? Is it the scientists and the athletes are just having a placebo effect? Or is this a performance benefit that so far the scientists haven't been able to pick up? Now, the argument from the scientist's perspective is that we know what happens if people have too much growth hormone. There is a condition called acromegaly, where the pituitary develops a benign tumour that produces excess amounts of growth hormone, and it leads to situations like this, where individuals get big hands, changes in their facial appearance, you get the change in metabolism, so they can get things like diabetes, they can get high blood pressure, and they can also get issues around the function of their nerves and joints. And you might say, well, this is not the sort of person that you would see on an Olympic starting line. So there have been a number of studies that have been done to actually try to determine whether growth hormone has performance enhancement benefit. A number of different people. Yes, it changes body composition, increases muscle mass, it reduces fat mass, as you would think. But actually, when you start to look at, does it really have an effect on the things that matter, like power, speed, and endurance? Actually, the studies don't suggest it. So who's got it right? Is it the scientist or is it the athlete? Well, I think that actually the athletes have got it right. I think acromegaly isn't a particularly good way of determining whether growth hormone is a benefit. And often if you ask people with acromegaly to think back 5 or 10 years before they were diagnosed, they often describe a situation where they have enhanced performance, and that's illustrated in this particular case history. This was a 21-year-old male medical student who went to Oxford for his clinical studies. He was a big lad. He was picked for the rowing team. He grew a further 5 centimetres while he was at Oxford at the age of 21, which probably should have set alarm bells running, but it didn't. He was fed well, he exercised well, and he found that he was able to recover from his training much more quickly than a lot of his compatriots. And in fact, at the height of his career, he actually won the Thames Head of the River race in a pair with Matthew Pinsent, now 4 times Olympic gold medalist. Unfortunately, just before the Blues race, he lost his place because his performance went down. He went off, finished his clinical training, and when he started his clinical training, asked for a size 8 glove. It didn't fit. He could just get his hand into a size 10 glove, and suddenly the penny dropped that he'd developed acromegaly. I should say that he was successfully treated and he's very well. And if you ever want a good read about a description of acromegaly, this is a good paper that describes that.
Is it reversible, the condition?
Yes. I mean, some things aren't. So, for example, his growth is not going to change. But things like the metabolic abnormalities, some of the excess of tissue deposition, yes, they are reversible with treatment.
But would that be okay then, if that, as opposed to someone taking it artificially, someone who's generating it because they've got a physical problem?
That would not count as a doping offence. No. So in other words, and that's also true. So for example, if there is a medical reason for any adverse analytical finding, then that is a legitimate reason for not being adverse. So there we have an example of performance enhancement of growth hormone in a natural state, but there have also been studies now done looking at doing the right experiment, saying that under the right situations, the growth hormone can be performance enhancing. So this was a particular study looking at the use of looking at the use of growth hormone in people who had previously used anabolic steroids but had stopped for 12 weeks, and where those individuals took growth hormone, they were able to not only see the changes in body composition that they would like, but also improvements in power output and squat thrust, and also physical fitness as measured by how much oxygen they could take up during exercise. And a very similar study undertaken in Australia again showed that in men where testosterone was combined with growth hormone, they got a greater effect than either taking growth hormone or testosterone alone. So I've told you the good sides of growth hormone. Why shouldn't we see it? Well, one of the things it does is to cause fluid retention. So it can cause things like high blood pressure, it can cause diabetes, it can also affect the heart, and there are also potentially risks of long-term cancer as well in the unregulated doses of growth that athletes are taking. When we come to detect growth hormone, there are significant challenges that are not there when we think about anabolic steroids. Most of the anabolic steroids, they should not be there. So if they're there, the only way they could have been is because of those individuals having taken it. On the other hand, growth hormone should be there. You know, we've all got growth hormone. One of the other challenges about growth hormone is that it's secreted in bursts, in pulses. And at the height of the burst, it's probably 100 or even 1,000 times higher than when it's down at the trough. And just to make things even more complicated, the things that are likely to put your growth hormone out during the day are exercise and stress. So you would absolutely expect that growth hormone levels after a race are going to be high. Now, from a medical perspective, when you are trying to determine whether somebody's got acromegaly or not, what you can do is you can take repeated blood samples, every 20 minutes or so, to actually see whether those individuals have got persistently elevated growth hormone. On the other hand, you can't do that to athletes. You cannot sit them down after a race and say, you're going to be here now for the next 24 hours while we're going to take blood samples. It's just not feasible to do that. And for reasons of the biochemistry of the hormones, we have to do blood testing, we can't do urine testing for it. So there are a number of different challenges. And there have really been two approaches that have been used to try to detect growth hormone peaks. And these are known as the Isoform Method, which was developed in Germany by Christian Strasberger and Martin Bidlingmeier and Zita Wu, and the method that I've been working on with colleagues in Southampton and at King's College London and also in Canterbury, the so-called marker method, where we look at other markers of growth hormone use. So just to talk a little bit about both of these methods very in brief. Now, when you say something like growth hormone, the fact that it's in the singular makes you think that this is just a single entity. But in fact, the growth hormone that's made from the pituitary comes in a number of different forms, a number of different sizes, and they're all just produced by the pituitary. Some are slightly more active than others, some form aggregates, but it's all the same. It's basically all having the same effect. On the other hand, when you make growth hormone in a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant, it's only one of those types. So for the human growth hormone, it has this major form which weighs 22 kilodaltons in its molecular weight, but there are also a number of other isoforms. When it comes from a pharmaceutical laboratory, it's just that 22 kilodalton growth hormone. So the principle of the test is that we can start to detect the ratio of this 22 kilodalton growth hormone to the total amount. And what happens is that when growth hormone is administered, it affects the way the body produces growth hormone normally. So this is the second big biochemistry physiology slide. I will be testing you about it before I let you go out of the door at the end of it. If you can't remember it, we'll have to go through it again. No, I'm joking, of course. But just to go through this in a little bit of detail, just to give a context. So growth hormone comes from this gland at the base of the brain called the pituitary, in this multiple different forms. It then acts on a number of different tissues by interacting with a receptor that sits on the cell surfaces, and that then leads to the production of a number of secondary hormones, one of which is called IGF-1. So you give growth hormone, IGF-1 goes up. Now, if you take growth hormone exogenously by injection, the growth hormone still acts on the growth hormone receptor. It leads to the increase of IGF-1. But what it does do is that one of the effects of IGF-1 is to act on the pituitary to switch off the growth hormone that the body makes normally. So what you can see is that if you give growth hormone, the amount that will be weigh 22 kilodaltons will suddenly be proportionately much, much higher. And so if you can measure 22 kilodalton as opposed to all of the growth hormone and see change in that ratio, you can then determine whether somebody has been taking growth hormone or not. The test was first introduced in 2004 at the Athens Olympic Games and subsequently used at Turin and Beijing and most recently in London. But despite having been introduced in 2004, the first positive test wasn't for 6 years, and that positive test, as I mentioned already, was Terry Newton. So there is a question, there are two possible explanations. Actually, athletes aren't taking growth hormone like we think they are, or there are issues related to the test. And one of the issues related to the test is that it has a very short window of opportunity for detection. So the time over which that growth hormone is no longer being made from the pituitary is about 12 to a maximum of 24 hours. So in other words, you have to take that blood test within 12 to 24 hours of the last injection if you're going to catch the athlete. So this is all in the public scientific domain. If you're a clever athlete, you think, well, I'm going to go to the London Olympics. All I need to do is to stop taking this test, taking the growth hormone, a day before I turn up at the Olympic Village, and I'm not going to get caught. In some circles, this has been dubbed as an IQ test rather than a growth hormone test. And it's probably the use of this test is much, much more likely to catch somebody who, in an out of competition, unannounced test, rather than in the traditional post-competition test.
Can you not make the isometric as well?
You can, but so far, the 20 kilodalton, which is the second isoform, has been manufactured as well, but only in one situation. So, I mean, in theory, people could actually manufacture growth hormone, but in terms of the process that's required to produce growth hormone, it's at least another order of magnitude more complicated than manufacturing anabolic steroids. So it would not be easy to do that, but in theory, yes you can. But the other things I was going to mention is that although cadaveric growth hormone is not available for therapeutic use because of the risk of Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease, it is still widely available on the black market. And so an athlete who wants to avoid being caught by this test can just take cadaveric growth hormone, and it is being found in targeted raids and also in custom smuggling. So yes, you can get around that test by doing it. Of course, you put yourself at risk of Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease, but as we've discussed already, the athlete's focus is much more in the short term rather than in the long term. Which is why we actually felt that there is a need to develop another test that has a longer window of opportunity and would still detect people taking cadaveric growth hormone as well as recombinant human growth hormone from a pharmaceutical perspective. Now, when somebody takes growth hormone and has these changes in their physiology, it's not as if it's a magic effect that suddenly you take the drug and all of these things change. What you can see is changes in other proteins and the manufacture of other proteins that then lead on to these changes. And our view was, well, okay, measuring growth hormone itself is difficult because of this pulsatile measure, but perhaps there are other proteins that we can also measure that will respond to growth hormone administration, and that they are likely to be more stable than growth hormone, and we can measure them over a long period of time. And this work's now been going on for some 15 years or so, and we finally got to the test being introduced at the London Olympics last year. So what we did was, what my fellow colleague Professor Peter Sampson did originally, was to start off with a panel of proteins that was about 35. They were then whittled down to 9 for greater study, and we've now whittled it down finally to 2 proteins, one of which is IGF-1, the protein that I was mentioning already that's produced by the liver that acts back in the pituitary, and the second, the collagen protein that is produced by soft tissue, both of which go up in response to growth hormone. They tend to remain up for several days or weeks after the administration of growth hormone, which provides us with a much longer window of opportunity to detect how an athlete who's been taking growth hormone. Precisely how long that window of opportunity is will depend partly on the amount of growth hormone that they've taken and how long they've been taking it. It also depends slightly whether you're a man or a woman. I could give you details, but I would have to shoot you afterwards. We also know that these markers are unaffected by other things that can affect growth hormone secretion, so things like ethnicity, the effect of exercise itself, and also injury. We've validated the test across a number of different populations to show that this is a test that can be used worldwide. And as I say, we managed to catch 2 Russian Paralympians within 6 weeks of the test being introduced. Okay, so let's move on to the last hormone that I'm going to talk about tonight, which is erythropoietin. So erythropoietin is a hormone that increases the amount of red blood cells that the body makes, and of course if you have more red blood cells it means you can carry more oxygen, so therefore it's good for endurance, particularly being used frequently among cyclists. Of course, another alternative is if you don't want to use erythropoietin, you can just take blood transfusion straight away. Again, a number of high-profile cases. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I would just like to give you the one case history. This is a chap called Tyler Hamilton, who was a colleague of Lance Armstrong. So Tyler Hamilton was disqualified for having self-administered blood transfusion. So I think, well, how did they actually detect whether somebody's had a blood transfusion? Now, are you all familiar with AB, O, and positive, rhesus positive, negative for your blood group? Well, that relates to proteins that sit on the surface of the red blood cells. And as well as those, there are a whole host of others. And if you start to look at them, you can start to define populations of red blood cells. And what happened was that about 95% of Tyler Hamilton's blood cells were all one type, and then the rest were just another type. So suggesting that he'd had a blood transfusion. So he was brought up before a court of arbitration in sports and said, well, this is the finding, you've been blood doping, haven't you? To which the answer said, no, I haven't. So, well, here's the adverse analytical finding, you have. Please would you explain it? Ah, I'm a chimera, he says. So what's a chimera? That's where you've got 2 sets of genetic material in the same person. It's incredibly rare, but it can sometimes happen. So how do you explain that you're a chimera, Mr. Hamilton? I had a twin-to-twin transfusion. So what can happen, sometimes if you've got a twin pregnancy, the blood from one twin can go to the other twin, and that can, again, not common, but it can happen. And that can then affect the subsequent genetic material that's in the twin that's had the transfusion. So, yes, it's a possibility. Ah, but Mr. Hamilton, you were a singleton birth. You weren't a twin. Thanks. I had a twin, but the twin died before I was born, and that again can happen. So it's all theoretically possible that this could happen. Of course, what the anti-doping agencies did was they then took another blood sample 6 months down the line, and this chimeric population had disappeared. And if it was a true chimera, it had still been there. So that's how he actually he was finally caught. The reason why I say it's $1 million case, that's how much it cost the US anti-doping agency to prosecute him. So.
But he kept doing it, it'd have been all right.
as long as he continued to get the blood from the same person.
Yeah.
So why do people take it? As I mentioned, it increases the amount of red blood cells, it increases oxygen transfer. It can increase, it's same sort of effects as altitude training.
When blood is transfused, does it include white blood cells as well as red?
It can do.
Because surely then they could do DNA tests on the white blood cells.
Centrifuge.
I mean, in theory that is correct, but the proportion is probably too small to detect easily. But yes, you can. So for example, if you get a fetus transfusion into a mother, you can detect that, but it is difficult to do. Why don't we do it? Well, it can increase the amount of clotting, so that can increase the risk of things like stroke, and obviously the risk of infection, including things like viral infections such as HIV through blood transfusion. EPO, when it's given, has different molecular patterns, so those can be detected just by doing the these sorts of gels to actually look at the different patterns of the EPA that's present. Okay, now I'm aware that we're slightly running behind time, but just a very quick word about therapeutic use exemption. So as I say, there are some people who need to take drugs for health reasons, but there's then a question about whether we should be preventing them from performing. So, for example, somebody with type 1 diabetes must take insulin. Insulin is a banned drug because of its performance-enhancing effects. So there are a number of different regulations that allow this. So it's important that as a sports doctor that you are aware of what athletes are taking, and if you know that the drug that they're taking is prohibited, that you have to apply for a therapeutic use exemption. It's important to think about other alternatives to that drug. So we talked a little bit earlier about beta blockers in things like archery and snooker. Beta blockers are used to treat high blood pressure, but there are other drugs that could be used as alternatives. On the other hand, when you start to think about things like diabetes, insulin for people with type 1 diabetes is the only choice, so there isn't an alternative. So for that situation, you have to think about a therapeutic use exemption, and in order to be provided with a therapeutic use exemption certificate, which should be collected before somebody competes, it's not something to collect afterwards. There has to be proper medical documentation of the diagnosis, so you can't just say, I've got diabetes, this is my insulin. There has to be proper evidence for that. Equally, it's important that the amount of medication is proportionate, so somebody can't have 100 times the amount of insulin just because they've got diabetes. So it's important, obviously, to do that. So, just to wind up, and I hope maybe a little bit of time for questions if there are more questions. I think we've shown that hormones have been used to enhance performance for very, very many years. What we also have seen is that as pharmacology is progressing, the use of these drugs is becoming ever more sophisticated, but equally other testing methods. And I think there is still a feeling within the room, despite some of the discussions that we had around the ethics, that we don't want our athletes to dope, because there is something about sport which is more than just entertainment. And we also need to think about protecting our athletes and keeping them healthy too. So thank you all for listening.
Great, well, I think that's got lots of us thinking about an awful lot of things. So, who would like to kick off? I think Cafe Boston can bear with us for a bit longer bit of time. I'll go there and I'll go there.
How do you test the effectiveness of your testing methods? Do you give people these drugs or people who are using therapeutic?
Yeah, no, we as part of the development of the test, we had to give growth hormone to healthy individuals in order to show how these proteins, how IGF-1 and how P3MP change in response to it. But of course, one of the entry requirements for the studies that we did in Southampton and previously in London was that these had to be done in amateurs. They couldn't be done in people who are competing at a professional level. And that was an absolute requirement to take part in the test. Now, of course, that then has a slight issue that, in order to be performing at a professional level, that the likelihood is that your physiology might be subtly different from people who are not competing at a professional level. And in order to try to address that, the benchmarking, i.e. the reference ranges that we then determined against which athletes are then measured, came from elite athletes. So we have taken blood samples from over 1,000 athletes after competition and at other times, just to see what levels of IGF-1 and P3MP we would expect to see in a group of healthy clean athletes.
Anna, do you have something there and then we'll come over to the side?
There's a condition in which people produce too much blood, as far as I know. Would that make them better athletes, or do the side effects of the illness hurt?
Yeah, I mean that again is an interesting question. I think you're talking about a condition called polycythemia rubra-vera, where the body does start to produce too much red blood cells. Now, unfortunately, in that situation, it's often very uncontrolled, and those individuals can run into problems of either lack of production of other cells that come from the bone marrow, such as white blood cells, which has a disadvantage, but also they have this risk of thrombosis. Having said that, there was a famous cyclist who had a very mild gene mutation in the erythropoietin gene. So what it did was it pushed the red blood cell count up a little, but not to the point where he started having loads and loads of problems with thrombosis. And as a result of that, he then competed very well. And because that was a natural variation in his genetic makeup, that was considered as fair.
Question earlier, sorry.
How good are the tests? I mean, every test has a degree of false positive and false negative.
Yeah.
And you mentioned someone killed themselves because they've been found to be positive. How sure can you be that?
Okay, so I mean you're absolutely right. So what you're always doing is you're trading off the ability to catch everybody who's been doping against not wanting to catch people, not wanting to falsely accuse athletes. And the way that the pendulum, the scales are weighted, are very much in favour of the athlete. So the doping agencies are prepared to let people get away with it if it means that you will not catch, not falsely accuse athletes. Now, what does that actually mean in practice? Well, this, I guess, is more a legal question rather than a scientific question. But what the doping agencies have said is that the level of false positive tests has to be about 1 in 10,000 tests. Now, that sounds, well, you know, there were 3,000 athletes turned up at London, there were 3,000 last time, there were 3 times the time before, so by the time you've actually had 3 lots of Olympics, are you going to risk catching one athlete? Now, that might be fair, except for the fact that for every test that is done, it's done twice, and it's done on 2 samples. So the chances of actually being falsely accused are actually quite significantly lower than 1 in 10,000. I can't give you the exact number because of the statistical.
But it's a
the
problem with other tests at the moment. Breast cancer or something.
Yeah, I mean there is always this, and part of the issue is that when you start to think about what is normal in clinical medicine, is that the normal ranges define about 95% of the population. Now, of course, when you're starting to think about athletes, you can't have 95%. You've got to define 99.9% of the population, 99% of the population, which is much, much lower chance of actually of finding somebody and accusing them falsely.
But you're actually dealing with a group of elite athletes.
Yes.
And it may be they're elite because they have abnormalities in their body chemistry
Yes.
already.
Which is why, when we develop the reference ranges, the benchmark is that you are benchmarked against an elite athlete. You're not benchmarked against a member of J public.
But at that end of the spectrum, variation is likely to be greater.
Oh, actually, I mean, there is some difference in terms of IGF-1 and P3MP between elite athletes and non-elite athletes, but actually it's not that great, and the same is also true for the Isoform test. Now, having said that, if somebody has an adverse analytical finding and they are able to show a medical reason why they have that adverse analytical finding, they will not be found guilty of a doping offence. So, for example, if the medical students I described had had the test, and the likelihood is he would have been caught by the test because of the acromegaly, if he was to say, well, the reason why I have my positive test is because I've got acromegaly and I've got good medical evidence to support the fact that I've got acromegaly, he would not then be...
Well, we didn't know that at the time because he didn't actually discover that until sometime
Well,
after.
no, I mean, he wouldn't have known it at the time, but one of the if somebody was to have a growth hormone test, our test, and had an adverse analytical finding, that finding would be communicated to the athlete and his medical team. And it may be that that's the sign that athletes needs to go and seek medical help in order to find whether they've got acromegaly or not. Now, in fact, what happened for those two Russians is that they admitted it. They both admitted that they'd taken growth hormone and they found it, which obviously is.
If you've got a medical team who can research that, then fair enough. If you're an athlete who is just doing really well, you don't have the backup. Where do you stand there?
Well, I think most of those athletes will have access to the level of medical expertise that they need to find that.
Basically, if they're being tested, they've got the back. Yeah, because the test's certainly going to be interested in the sort of people that would have the sort of back.
Apart from the Jamaican bobsleigh team.
Do people that take growth hormone develop symptoms of acromegaly? Like, do they get like the big hands on the negative side?
I think in theory they may. Unfortunately, what we don't know is how long and how much growth hormone people are taking. And there is some suggestion that people take it intermittently rather than continuously. So it may be that they're not developing the physical features that you see of acromegaly. But I think the other thing to remember is that by the time somebody is often diagnosed with acromegaly, the likelihood is that they will have had excess growth hormone production for maybe 10 years. And it may be that the amounts that they develop in acromegaly are much, much higher than even athletes are given themselves.
Blood doping, if they use their own blood after high altitude training or they sneak into one time, is that okay?
No, it's not okay.
Is it easy to catch them?
No, it's not easy to catch them, but the ways in which self-auto-transfusion is detected is that when you have, in order to have the transfusion, you have to take the blood out and you have to store it somewhere until you can then give it back. And what can happen is that some of the plastic in the bottles, in the bags that are the blood is collected in, can then be detected in the blood or urine samples afterwards. And that's the way it's detected, but it's not easy.
It's alright if you store it in glass.
You might want to gloss it before you give it back. But
Anna, do you have how long post-competition will athletes be available for doping tests?
that slightly depends on the competition, but for some sports they have to be available 365 days a year.
Okay.
I mean, clearly they don't have to be available in the middle of the night. You're not going to get an anti-doping officer knocking on the door in the middle of the night. But what the athletes have to let the anti-doping agencies know where they're going to be, so that if the anti-doping agencies decide that a test is due, that the officers know where to go. And there are actually some really quite stringent regulations around anti-doping tests. So, for example, if the sample that's required is a urine test rather than a blood test, that once the athlete's been informed, they are not allowed to leave the presence of the anti-doping officer until that sample has been administered, which obviously can be quite difficult. If you've just run the marathon, you're dehydrated, the last thing in the world you want to do is actually go for a pee. So it can be a number of hours that they have to do that, and you have to be witnessed giving that urine sample. You can't just say, I want to go into the loo and do it, because unfortunately there have been situations in the past where, and here's the urine that my mate produced earlier, happened, that people have created false bladders, false penises, in order to provide samples. There have been situations where people have injected urine into their own bladders in order to provide their...
That's not worth it.
Question here?
You said that the first fatality cause used by steroids in one sentence, and in the other sentence you used the word probably the cause. have you got any proof, 100% proof, where steroids have been the basis of death? And also, was the 10-year lifespan after using steroids hypothetical?
Oh yeah, I mean that Sports Illustrated study, that was completely hypothetical.
Okay.
But I think so. I think that study really is illustrative of the mentality of sportsmen, rather than this is what would definitely happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess are the definite definite situations where deaths have been caused. It's difficult really to say. I mean, not least because a lot of the athletes are not just taking one agent; they're often taking multiple agents. They sort of take a more Chinese medicine approach, a bit of this and a bit of that, and
So
putting
what
together.
cause of death been then, or something like that?
With anabolic steroids. So, for example,
Would it be classed as that?
heart attacks. So we do see quite frequently young men
Mhm.
attending casualty in their 20s with heart attacks.
Is that because they've abused it, or is that because that's what it would do, even if they use it sensibly?
I guess there's a question there. Is that can you use it sensibly?
I don't use it myself.
I'm very pleased to hear that.
I'm just curious because I'm trying to find out where's the 100% proof that it actually kills people.
Well, I mean, I think that there are enough case reports of young men who've died of heart attacks having taken anabolic steroids for us to say that these drugs have actually caused those deaths.
You'll never get 100% proof of anything.
I just didn't know there was one that actually said, because looking at all the athletes, none of them look sort of terrible condition. Didn't know if it was had any beneficial sides to it.
Well, I mean, maybe
Is
the
it
pictures
more
maybe the pictures I showed were, they're good side. But no, but I mean, there are definitely cases of people who've died as a result of taking anabolic steroids. Joking apart.
I guess it's a bit of a risk though, because sports that attract like anabolic steroids the most, like weightlifting, etc. Like athletes often have like enlarged hearts anyway.
Yeah.
The workload is so much higher than they could avoid under. So their heart's already stressed more than the average person.
Yeah.
So it's like, I guess it's just a tipping over the edge really.
I mean, you're right. Obviously, these people who are putting lots of training in, and then they've got the effect of the drugs on top. But as I say, that there are just enough cases of people who turn up to casualty having had the heart attack in the 20s for us to say this is pretty clear that it has this effect.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know where you think this is heading. What's the next development, theoretically?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that athletes are always going to be one step ahead. We've talked a little bit, or heard a bit about gene doping, the possibility of injecting genetic material directly into muscles in order to improve performance that way. I think that is, I mean, there's certainly proof of principle experiments that can work. Whether athletes are actually doing that yet, I don't know. We already know of athletes who are taking IGF-1 because they're worried that they're going to get caught taking growth hormone, and the likelihood is there will be other things that, as they are developed, will then be used. So, I mean, I think that it is a bit of a never-ending story. But I guess part of the role of the World Anti-Doping Agency is to provide education about what, to try to dissuade people from doing it.
Back there.
So say when we're in a hypothetical future situation where people could actually get genetic changes to their bodies, they could make those happen for any number of reasons. Perhaps they have gender dysphoria or some other wish to change themselves that was unrelated to sport. Then after that they decided to get involved in the sport, would they then be obviously at risk of being disqualified because they changed themselves in a way that might keep them?
Well, I mean, there's the interesting situation of Caster Semenya, the South African athlete who has got androgen insensitivity syndrome, or at least allegedly has that. That's a situation where that the person who has the condition is genetically male, but because there is an abnormality in the receptor for the testosterone and other androgens, that they develop as a female. But they still have some aspects of masculinity, and it suggests that part of the reason why she is so physically advantaged is because of the testosterone that she has normally. Now, I think that the decision has been made that this is somebody who's been brought up as a woman. Her gender is quite clearly female, and therefore it's wrong to discriminate against her and say she has to compete with men. But I mean, I appreciate that's not quite what you're saying. You know, if you have somebody who starts life as a man who undergoes gender reassignment surgery to become a woman, how should they compete? And I think that, you know, again, I suspect that's more an ethical, philosophical question rather than one scientific.
It's not only that. There's, you know, if people were to sort of make other changes that would, you know, say, seem superficial at the time, perhaps, you know, to make their legs stronger or something, you know, to change some aspects of their physiology, only for, you know, other reasons that weren't even sport, but not also because of anything medical per se. That's going to be quite a question to answer.
Okay, I'm going to let you think about that because we've got a couple more questions to get in and I'm conscious of time. So if I invite you to ask your questions, then perhaps we can do a bit of a reading.
Me?
Yeah.
At one point you said, prior question, that the athletes were one step ahead. You're a professor at the minute. Are you not one step ahead? Why are they one step ahead? Being able to get around this?
Can I just ask Bryce to ask you a question and then...
My point was going to be, going back to the Semenya case, it was reported that she was going to have something suppressed within her, but they were going to try and suppress some level of something, but do you know what that actually was?
I presume it would be suppressing her testosterone levels, but I think that they didn't do that in the end. I think they just...
I don't know how much, how would they know how much to suppress it by? How do you set that baseline?
Well, you can look to see what, because the concentrations of testosterone are very different in men and women. So what you might say is you need to suppress it down into the female range. But I don't know whether that happened. I think it didn't actually, but I'm not 100% sure. So, sorry, the question was...
Why are they one step ahead?
Why are they one step ahead? They've got lots of funding and resources. There's a big will to win, innovation.
They're not always one step ahead. A lot of the times when they think something is right, they'll be wrong. But in many cases, because there's such a variation of... Sorry.
I mean, so they're better at getting grants.
Grants probably not the way that they get their money, but you know, so for example, to take the Balco case, the ones I mentioned where Marion Jones and Tim Montgomery were subsequently disqualified. The way that first came out, so it was a spent syringe with the flange on the end was sent to the anti-doping laboratory in Los Angeles, and Don Catlin, who was the head of the laboratory, took that tiny amount of fluid and identified the anabolic steroid that was in it. And if you think about the changes that I've mentioned to the anabolic steroids, there are changes that can be made around that chemical structure. The anabolic steroid that was in this in the syringe was several moves away from where they thought the current technology was. That just reflects the pharmacologists that have been working at Balco in order to develop it. And the reason why they were doing it, because they were making a profit out of it.
I guess the thing is, you don't really know what you're testing for until it's been used. Like, it's impossible to make a test that will discover any drug use, and then, like, it's constantly evolving. So it's not until it's being used that you can then develop a successful test.
Yes, in some cases, the athletes are using drugs that are actually intended for completely illicit uses, like growth hormone, that sort of thing. So the athletes then start to use it, but then you test them and work retrospectively. First, people know what they're using to start with, then develop the test. That takes time. At which point, it's put in the circulation for a period of time.
Yeah,
Well, they're quite smart athletes, like, well, coaches are anyway.
But you see, I think the other thing is that athletes are very good at knowing what their performance is, and they're also very good at knowing the effect of change. So if you want to do a clinical trial to bring in a new drug, you have to do a trial on several thousand people. You have to show that it has a large effect because there are going to be individual differences, and so therefore it has to be a large effect in order to see, to predict reliably whether a drug will have an effect in a population. Now, athletes are not worried about the population, they're worried about themselves. So if we say take the Athens rowing fours Olympic win, the difference in the winning time was about 0.08 of a second. So about 0.03% of the total race time was the winning distance. Now, of course, that winning distance, albeit small, made a huge amount of difference to the British team as opposed to the Canadian team who came second. Now, if you want to design a clinical trial that is going to find that sort of difference, there are just about enough people on the planet to recruit into that trial to do that. So you just can't find that. Whereas an athlete who takes a performance-enhancing drug and perhaps they find that their 100-metre time goes down by 100th of a second consistently, they will be aware of that. Whereas from a population perspective, you're never going to detect that. So athletes are actually, by using that trial of one person, have got a loss of ability to find the effects, very small effects that you're never going to find in clinical trials. And that's part of the reason why I think actually athletes are smarter than scientists in some regards when it comes to looking at these performance enhancing effects.
And I think at that point, quoting as athletes being smarter than scientists is probably a good point of proceedings to draw things to a close. But I think we could go on and on and on this evening. It's been an absolutely fascinating talk and a wonderful debate. So, Richard, thank you so much for coming to join us, and I hope we'll see you again here in Bournemouth. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for coming along this evening. I hope you really